This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have a special presentation. I did an interview with HoH Bastian, who is an anthropologist. She's teaching at the University of San Geronimo in Havana, Cuba, and she was kind enough to invite me to the university. I met with some professors, talked about the project, the Finca Paso Seco, that I was working on. She joined me and took me out, and we did some research, some anthropological interviews in Calabasar in Cuba, and it was just a fantastic experience, and I was really grateful that she shared her time and her efforts to help me on my project. Now, I also asked her to join me on the podcast, and after a very long day of ethnographic research and work in the field, I'm talking about starting at around 7 a.m. and then getting back around 5 p.m. with no real substantial break in the middle, just talking and asking people questions and going from place to place and looking for locations, she still agreed to sit down with me and have an interview. So you'll notice there's some background noise in this interview. That's because it's Cuba, and Cuba is the most lively, lovely place with noise always going on in the background. So don't let it bother you, because it's a fantastic interview, and hopefully you get a chance to go to your nearest library and check out her new book. Thanks for joining, and enjoy this interview with HoH Bastian. Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and I'm not in the regular Hour of History studios today because I am in a very special place with a very special guest. I'm here in Havana, Cuba, with HoH Bastian. Welcome to Hour of History. I guess I'm happy to be in this auxiliary studio. So tell me, what do you do in Havana?
Well, I'm a professor. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And I'm a cultural anthropologist. And I live here in Havana.
So the Hour of History listeners are typically historians, and they might be scared of these words like I am, cultural anthropology.
We're basically like the social historians of the present.
So, okay, so you're dealing with people who are alive.
Yes, cultures and people who are alive, and the things that they're doing that 20 years from now you guys will be studying.
Ah, so you're helping us out.
We're making the primary documents you will be reading in the future.
Oh, that's fantastic. But that makes me very nervous, because it seems like you have to deal with people, and like, is that hard to do?
People are cool. They're not scary. They're really not.
I'll stick to documents. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your research, what you've studied, how you ended up in Havana.
So, okay, well, my book, which is coming out this month, is called Everyday Adjustments in Havana: Economic Reforms, Mobility, and Emerging Inequalities.
Wow, and that's available in fine bookstores
everywhere. Available in research libraries near you. Ask your research library to order you a copy.
It sounds like it would be pertinent information for anyone interested in Cuba.
I hope so. Yeah.
So what is an everyday adjustment?
Well, so around 2011, and here's the part where I'm not a historian, but I lived the history, right? So if you've ever done an oral history interview, people mark past events to, when so-and-so was pregnant, or, when so-and-so went off to the war, it's not a real year. So I can't give you the real year. It's in the book, right?
Wow.
But around 2011, President Raul Castro, we began a reform process here in Cuba. And it was the second big economic reform process that the country has been through since the 90s, right? So in the 90s, we have what was called the special period, which was especially difficult time here in Cuba.
That's why it was special.
That's why it was special. No,
I'm sure you've never heard that joke before.
It was special because it was a moment when the state had to take special measures that are usually the measures you would take during time of war. But it was a special period and a time of peace. So all kinds of rationing measures, kind of like war footing, but during peacetime. And that was after the Soviet Union fell.
So good listeners of the show, if you check out my Cities podcast that I did on Havana, I mentioned a little bit about that. So did you ride on the Camello?
Yeah, I did. Oh. More times than I wish.
Tell me about that. What was that like?
This was a special period measured, and kind of a lot of the story of Cuba is what can you do with the little you have, right? So in the middle of, it was a crisis. If you come to Cuba today, what you see is not the Cuba of the 1970s, 80s, right? Before the Soviet Union fell, Havana was a completely different city, right? And it's as if in the United States tomorrow, there was no gasoline. Imagine what would happen to your everyday life.
I can't. People freak out if the subway's a minute late.
Exactly, right? So no gasoline, and then everything just kind of goes downhill from there, right? So no gasoline means no power plants. No power plants means no electricity. No electricity means no air conditioning. It also means no fans in Havana in August. Without fans or air conditioning.
That does not sound fun.
No. So everything changed overnight, right?
But I'm sorry, I took us a bit afield, but this is not the everyday adjustment. That's like a momentous adjustment.
Right.
You work with everyday adjustment.
Right, exactly. So there's these big things that happen, right? Huge changes. Soviet Union falls. Overnight, Cuba loses almost all of its imports, everything. And how do you adjust to that, right? So the state makes adjustments. They declared it's a special period in times of peace, extraordinary measures to try to keep the country moving, right? To keep things from being paralyzed. But, on the household level, which is what I study as a cultural anthropologist, families have to make adjustments, people have to make adjustments, and then that's what I study. Right? So the everyday adjustments. And like I said, there's kind of two periods of economic reforms. The first was in the 1990s, where the state legalized the dollar. They opened up agricultural markets where farmers could bring their products directly and sell directly to the customers. They legalized the dollar. They allowed people to start some small businesses, pretty much self-employment, not even hiring other workers, but self-employment. And that was kind of the first wave of adjustments, right? And with President Raul Castro, there was a second wave around 2011. And it was called here in Cuba the process of the adjustments of the economic and political system, right?
So not as catchy of a name.
No. But so what my research is about is how people have adjusted to those adjustments.
Second period.
To the second period.
What is the Spanish for the second adjustment period?
Well, often people will talk about after the guidelines of social and economic policy, so the lineamientos.
Okay.
So post lineamientos is the period that I'm studying. So after 2011, different policies that took place. One of the most important was opening up self-employment. At the same time that the state employment was reduced. So you had about 90% of people working for the state before this happened. And then the goal with this adjustment was to bring it down closer to 70% and open up self-employment to allow people to work for themselves and start small businesses.
And so now, as a cultural anthropologist, you are living in this world. So you're making the adjustments too. Can you explain how does that sort of factor in? Like, how do you collect your data? Do you tell someone you are going to be in my book?
I think every Cuban has had to make adjustments. And it's funny because in the United States, I think a lot of times we have this image of Cuba as being just like this really static place where nothing changes. A lot of the the way that Cuba is talked about uses these tropes, right?
They drive old cars.
The old American cars.
I hear one now.
Exactly. The old American cars, the cigars, the kind of vintage look.
You mean that's not real Cuba?
That's not real Cuba.
No.
No, I know. It's really funny, actually, because the old American car, which is really, I think, in the United States, a symbol of Cuba, and this Cuba that we think is like stuck in time, if you dig a little deeper, it actually is a pretty good symbol of Cuba, because if you open up that hood, right? So on the outside, it looks like this old car that nothing is changed. You open up that hood, you're going to see a Toyota, right? You're going to see a Toyota engine that was brought, from wherever. You're going to see Russian parts. You're going to see Chinese parts. You're going to see the whole world under that hood, right?
Wow.
And Cuba's like that too, right? Because
Yeah,
Americans
totally.
think, it's just like, stuck in time. It's it hasn't changed.
I don't know how many times I've heard, I want to go before it changes, and I think look around, it's changed every second of every day. Is this everyday adjustments?
Every day.
No, it's interesting because I did notice in the car today the Hyundai steering wheel in this old American car, and it is really like Cuba. Historically too, because like the project I work on, the refugees, there's just a constant mixture. But surely this is not unique to Cuba, is it? What is your sort of interaction like? Is your anthropology only... It's Havana, right? So how representative of it is, say, Cuba? Is Havana of Cuba?
Havana is Havana.
Yeah.
And Cuba is Cuba. And Havana is a part of Cuba. But I'm very clear, and that's why Havana is in the title. Everyday adjustments in Havana, right?
Yeah.
Because Havana is very different from the rest of the country. And unfortunately, a lot of the scholarship that gets produced about Cuba gets produced in Havana or by people from Havana, but it gets the title Cuba, right? So people say, what's that like in Cuba? And the answer is a study about Havana, right?
Right.
And Havana is very different. It's like going to New York City. If someone comes to the U.S., visits Manhattan, or even if let's let them go to all the 5 boroughs, right?
Yeah.
And then they go back to wherever and they say they've been in the United States and they got it figured out.
Yeah.
Like, no.
I mean, it's much more, yeah.
It's much more. And it's, the capital city has more in common with other capital cities all over the world than it does, with the countryside around it.
So in your work, when you're, like, how many people do you sort of include in it? Like, how big are these circles?
Right. Well, I mean, my research as a cultural anthropologist, one of the most important tools that we have is participant observation, right? Which is being there, right? Being there, observing, talking to people, putting yourselves in the other shoes, right?
Yeah.
So just what you historians are trying to imagine when you're...
Yeah, we're like so far removed, it seems.
Yeah, so that's our main, that's our main methodology as anthropologists and as ethnographers. But then we also do, we do interviews, we do. So
this book takes place in 2011 afterwards, but you did this. So then people just listen. Oh, in 2011. So you got here, and this is where your book takes place. But surely you had to establish these relationships before. So can you tell me a little bit about your history with Cuba? Like, what is your relationship to this? I mean, or should I say with Havana?
Yeah, with Havana, actually. I wish I knew as much about the rest of the country as I've been able to learn about Havana. So I was able to spend a semester here as a student when I was in the university studying abroad. And that was the first kind of long semester that I was able to spend here.
How cool. So you got a study abroad in Havana in the 90s.
No, I'm not that old. 2002.
Oh, because you talked about the special period like it was... Was it still going on in 2002? So you see the trail end of the special period then?
Yeah.
Okay,
that's-
no, that was not a comment on the age.
No.
Let the record show.
I love radio. Yeah. No, it's an interesting question because the question of has the special period ended or not is something that's definitely very much up to debate because economically, has the country recovered to the point that it was at in the 1980s? No, right?
So we could.
But things have changed a lot. And we're definitely, as a country, not in the same place we were.
So how did you score the study abroad? Was this part of Latin American studies or?
This was, so in 2002, this was a period of kind of coming together, of normalization.
Okay,
Before President Bush.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was a mini boom of study abroad programs coming to Havana. And then with Bush, George W. Bush, he really shut down those opportunities.
Right.
And it wasn't until Obama that those kind of opportunities really opened up again.
So you were at the University of Havana, or okay, cool.
Yep, I spent a semester at the University of Havana.
And then you were like, this place is pretty cool. I need to study this place.
That's pretty much the way it is.
And how long was it? How long you spoke Spanish when you came, or how?
I studied Spanish when I was in college. One of my majors was sociology, anthropology, and the other was Spanish. So I came to Cuba with
a
little bit of Spanish under my belt, and learned much more here in Havana.
And then you went back, and when did you get to come back to Cuba?
Yeah, when I graduated from undergraduate, I came back to Cuba and started working, and worked with a couple different projects over the years.
That's very cool. Is that because of the experience or the relationships you made when you were here, or because to me that sounds like really impressive because it's not sort of like, well, when I graduated, I went and taught in China, and it was just at the beginning where you could apply for jobs like online, and this was 2010. Yeah. So how did you get a job? This is so cool. I think.
Yeah. Well, I worked with an NGO from the U.S. that's called Witness for Peace. And it's a really, really interesting organization. It started in the 80s in Nicaragua, where they kind of go everywhere the U.S. government goes.
Yeah, it's like the embassy.
And they do a lot of accompanying communities in Latin America who are being affected by U.S. foreign policy. So in Nicaragua in the 80s, the Contra War, the U.S. funding, all of those groups.
For those of you listening this is an excellent time to check out our previous podcast on the Sandinistas. That is so cool. So we didn't mention that, but this organization was there.
Yeah, and so this is an organization, Witness for Peace. They're organized regionally in different parts of the United States. And their mission is to take U.S. citizens to Latin America and connect them with social movements in Latin America to learn about the impacts of U.S. foreign policy. So, where are U.S. tax dollars going? What are they doing in Latin America?
So you can travel anywhere in Latin America.
Yeah, so they have programs in Nicaragua, in Colombia, in Cuba, in Mexico.
Those are all the fun countries.
Yeah, so wherever the U.S. is,
wow.
They connect U.S. citizens with local people who are impacted by U.S. foreign policy. And it's an amazing experience. You get to meet people in social movements in these different countries. But the idea is more than a tour. The idea is that what you learn and the experiences that you have, you take back to your community in the U.S.
Wow.
And teach others. So people will come. I worked with them in Cuba and I worked in Mexico with them after I graduated from college. And here in Cuba, we were teaching people about the U.S. embargo.
Yeah.
And how does the U.S. embargo impact Cuban families? And then the people that came on our trips would go back to wherever they're from, Minnesota, California, North Carolina, and they would, give a talk at their church, at their local library, They would go lobby their senators
Yeah.
and talk about what they saw.
So you've been dealing with American cars for a long time. Because that must be like what people often...
Yeah, so the funny thing is those old American cars, that's like a part of our public transportation system here.
Yeah, can you explain that?
So way before Uber was invented in the United States.
Way before it was cool. Yeah.
Way before it was cool. Here in Cuba, pretty much anybody who has a car, you always need some extra cash. Since the 1990s, salaries it's hard to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who have cars do the taxi thing. So they'll drive down a route that's pretty much the same as the bus route. And folks who have a little more money are able to use these collective taxis. So they go pretty much on the same routes as the buses, 10 Cuban pesos, about 50 cents of a dollar. And you can get on or off any part of the route. And those old American cars are the backbone of that system here in Havana.
Exactly like Uber, except it's easier.
Yeah. You don't need an app. You don't need a credit card. You just stick your arm out and the car stops.
And I assume you don't need to tip.
No, I mean you're paying the driver,
right?
Right?
Yeah.
And
there's no middleman.
There's no middleman. And like I said, at least since the 90s, this has been going on.
Very cool. And that, I feel like that also kind of tells us a little bit about Cuban culture, though. It takes a lot of trust to get in a car and say, right? This is not something you do in America. Like, it's kind of like hitchhiking, right?
It's kind of funny because, you're right. Like it tells you a lot about Cuban society, right? Because it's a collective taxi, and Cuba's a very collective society, right? And you mentioned hitchhiking in the 1990s. One of the things that happened was, there was no oil, there was no gas. We invented these camellos, which are these huge, basically like a trailer, like a tractor, not a tractor trailer, like a semi-truck with a big, trailer behind and a couple seats. And that was the bus during the 1990s because it was the most efficient way to move as many people as you could, right?
Right.
And another thing that happened in the 90s was, that's related to hitchhiking, is that all of the gas that there was, belonged to the government. Mm-hmm. And if it belongs to the government, it belongs to the people.
Yeah.
And it's for the people, right? So let's say that I'm the director of some sort of state agency, and I have a car because of my responsibilities as the director of this agency, and I have gas for my car that the state gives me a quota. But that gas isn't my gas. It's a state's gas.
Right.
And the state's is the people.
So
right?
They have to give you a right of way.
So I have to give anyone, if I'm driving in that car, that gas is not mine. It's the people's gas.
And people believe that.
It was the law.
That's the reality.
That's the reality. That was the reality in the 1990s. They called them amarillos, yellow, right? So it was a person who's dressed all in yellow, was the uniform, and their job was to stop all of the state cars. Some cars belong to people, but you can tell by the license plate letter and the colors back then. They had different colors. But so this person's job is to stop all of the state-owned cars on the highway and ask them where they're going. And if you're going somewhere, you go and you find the amarillo, you stand next to amarillo, and you wait in line until a car comes that's going the direction you're going. Well, and they have to take you.
Yeah, so it's not about believing the collective. It is.
It is.
It is.
It is.
Wow. Right? That's very interesting. So do you find this to me, I hear that and I think innovation, creativity, and community. Do you find these things in the everyday adjustments that you write about? Is innovation a theme?
I mean, what I just told you about the amarillos, that's an adjustment. That's an adjustment that was made in the 1990s, right? Mm-hmm. Because the problem was a problem for the society of how do we move people, right? What can the state do? What do we have? We have this little bit of gas, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to give it to this, this manager of the company that has to go and look for, materials and then drive back to the factory, something like that, right? So we give it to that guy, right? But there's 4 other seats in the car.
Yeah.
And there's people that need to go places, right? So It
makes sense.
It makes sense.
And so are you now? You have to narrow your scope somehow, right? Do you limit yourself to, I'm only going to write about changes that are happening in the house or on the street, or how do you draw where the walls go up?
Right. Well, so I choose the households rather like as my unit of analysis, right? Rather than talking about individual stories, I talk about household stories, right? Because here in Havana, one of the things that unfortunately the revolution has not been able to solve, one of the problems, is the housing problem, right? And so you have generations of people living in the same households. Maybe most of the households in Havana are multi-generational households, right? So you have, mom, dad, kids, grandma, grandpa, maybe some uncles or aunts, maybe some kids. Depends on the household. But the household is the unit of the economic unit, right?
Right.
Is the household, not the individual. So if I were to study, people as individuals, I would just see one person. I would see this person is a teacher.
Yeah.
And their salary is this, 400 pesos. This person is a teacher. How does this person survive on that salary? I wouldn't understand anything, right? Because they don't just survive on that salary. So who else is in the household, right? Maybe the wife works in a hotel. Maybe the father-in-law works with an international company. Mm-hmm. Maybe the son lives abroad and sends remittances, right? So you really have to look at the households.
So one book that I have my students read, it's Slavinka Draculich's Cafe Europa, where she's a journalist who writes after the fall of Yugoslavia, basically, a Croatian journalist. And one thing she highlights frequently is the us or I versus we mentality of the socialist societies in Eastern Europe, and this transition from the fall of the Soviet Union to present day. That's been like one of the biggest issues, because in the West it's like super individualistic society, selfies everywhere. But how does that fit into like the sort of collective mindset? Do you still find individualism in your households? And where do I find it? Where do I see the individuals?
Well, so in the book, there's two specific policies that I look at, right, that changed as a part of these adjustments to the economic and political system. And one of those adjustments are kind of this coupling of layoffs, state layoffs, right? So people who worked for the state. And one of the things that was talked about that needed to be done to try to bring the country into some sort of economic equilibrium and for the revolution in the country to continue to survive was to cut down the state payrolls, right? And they did this at the same time that they allowed people to take out licenses to start small businesses or to become self-employed, right? And that has been a huge adjustment for a lot of people, right? And generationally. Right. So this revolution happened not because of one person. Right. In the United States, I think there's a lot of focus on Fidel. Right. In the U.S., they call him Castro.
Wait, there's other people in Cuba? No. But
yeah. So in the U.S., they call him Castro. But here in Cuba, people call him Fidel. Uh-huh. They're on a first name basis with him.
Right. And that's how
So Fidel didn't do it alone.
Right.
It was a popular movement.
Yeah.
And there's so many people who have stories of how this revolution was made. Right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just one guy. It was a popular movement, right? And so one of the things, kind of the spirit of those times at the beginning of the revolution was, here's an underdeveloped country that's always been under the control of some, colonial power. First Spain, then the U.S. occupation, which began after the War of 1898 until 1902, a U.S. protectorate. Constitution was written during that time, the first Constitution. The Capitol building, which, any visitor that comes has seen it. It looks really similar to one in D.C. That was built during that time, right? So Cuba was always... the big landowners were always foreign. After the Independence War, everything was pretty much destroyed, and American companies came in and bought up So it's a small, underdeveloped country in Latin America, depending on one crop.
Yeah.
It's a story we've heard before, right?
Yeah.
Depending on sugar. And they used to say, without sugar, there's no country.
Right.
Right? And so this is the country that wanted to change that.
Uh-huh.
You know, they wanted Cuba for Cubans.
Right.
Right? And they made a revolution. Right?
But so like my Coca-Cola, I know the embargo and everything, but my Coca-Cola doesn't have real sugar anymore. And I saw even the one in Spain, I've been sampling the various Cokes while I'm here, Coca-Colas that is, while I'm here in Cuba, and I've had Mexican Coke, I've had Spanish Coke, I've had whatever,
Have you had two cola?
I have had two cola, so Cuban Coke, and they all use different chemicals, but it doesn't seem like sugar is a big one anymore. So these changes are a factor in, but what about the household? So the guy who worked for the state factory, and maybe the state continued to give him a job, even though there's no sugar factory happening, and then say he gets laid off, then what happens?
Well, if you look at just that guy,
Yeah.
you only get a piece of the story,
Yeah.
right? So two of the big policies in this last cycle of adjustments, one was, the layoffs in the state sector, the growth of the new small businesses, private sector, and the other was the recreation of the housing market. Because before 2011, housing didn't have an economic commodity value.
Uh-huh.
If you could trade houses. It's called the permuta system, but they tried to destroy the profit, profit part of it. So I look in the book at those two changes, and in terms of for generations, for people of different generations, this process of leaving the state sector and going into the private sector has been something that's really difficult for some people to understand, because at the beginning of the revolution there was this idea of, we're going to do something different. Like, we're going to develop this country. We're going to try to change and turn around from being a country that's dependent on a foreign power, dependent on one crop, right? When the price of sugar goes down, the whole country was in crisis. When the price of sugar goes up, everything's great, right?
Right.
And the project of the revolution at the beginning was to do something different, right? And to do something different required all hands on deck.
Yeah.
Everybody needed to have a place in the revolution, and to build this new society, which meant you worked. The idea that the older generation has now is that you work for society. You don't work for yourself.
Right. And
right?
these are, we're talking about people who've lived in this for 6 decades. So this is life. So I think, it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about life, and then to change it again seems to me like it would be traumatic.
I think
but Cubans don't strike me as traumatized.
I think it's been difficult for some people because, kind of your whole life, the idea is that you give everything you can to help develop your country. Mm-hmm. To try to have, an independent nation that doesn't depend on, a commodity price going up or down, right? So how do you do that? Like, the country needs engineers, the country needs teachers, the country needs doctors. Kind of this big, modernization project of the revolution required everybody to do everything they could, right? Mm-hmm. So, the literacy campaign in 1961, right? Eradicating literacy. It's not just the Cuban government that said, that literacy was eradicated. The UN said it. And all of these projects happened because everybody participated, right?
Right. And if you do that for 6 decades, then how is it? It's strange then to see, some of these people seem to be doing really well. Like, say you have a hostel, and it's not participating for everyone, right? Does that create tension, or?
I think one of the things that's been difficult over the last 30 years has been, since the special period began, the buying power of salaries.
Yeah.
Right? And it contributes to a situation which people here call the inverted pyramid. Inverted pyramid. So the people who, often the people who have the highest level of education, who work in technical or professional fields, they work usually in the state sector, right? Many of these state sector jobs are the jobs that need the most education, the most training, doctors, university professors, engineers. These are all jobs that can really only be done in the state sector.
Yeah.
And the salaries in the state sector are the same salaries that they were before the special period. They're in Cuban pesos. There have been slight adjustments, but since the crisis, they haven't kept up with the changes in the cost of living. So most of those folks either have to find, a side job driving these máquinas, the taxi, collective taxis, or somebody in their social network has to have access to some other source of capital.
And that's why the household unit is so important. So,
exactly.
So you could, if you have 3 children, one could perhaps be a doctor or lawyer, and then as long as one's driving a máquina, you're all right.
And unfortunately, one of the things that happens as a result of that is, families have to have some sort of access to hard currency, right? And that could come from, if your family has a car, being able to drive the car as a taxi in your off hours. If you have a good house, you can rent out a room to tourists, and then you can make a steady income in hard currency.
Wow.
As well.
Yeah, so that would be a challenge for anyone. I'm thinking of parallels here, like it's sort of similar to. And this, you probably hate when people do this. You're extrapolating, in something that you clearly have said is Havana. But I hear a lot of similarities with the sort of situation that teachers face in the United States, and sort of like whether it's state or private schools in the U.S. And you have these situations where cities like Manhattan are just exploding in wealth, but a teacher can't necessarily live in Manhattan, so they live in the Bronx, and they live in Brooklyn, and then they commute in, and then the trains aren't very good, but the people at the top aren't so worried about that. And as a result, what happens is, teachers have to, you can't be a single teacher, right? You have to be with someone else. You need a dual income. So in a weird sort of way, I see a lot of similarities with what's happening, albeit at a different scale, but there isn't a sort of inverted pyramid in the United States, or at least in economic imbalance where it's you have to have 2 incomes. You have to pool your income.
I think in a lot of ways, of course, the contexts are very different, and here in Cuba there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. But I think that things like education, unfortunately, that are not productive, they're seen as not being productive, which of course we know, everyone who produces anything went to school at some point.
And had a teacher that
they
inspired
learned to
them.
read.
Yeah.
They learned to read, and that's the production that teacher is making. But that doesn't, those points don't go back to. But yeah, so I think that the household is really important for understanding kind of the economic realities of Cuba today. And for people of different generations, it's been really hard to think about leaving the state sector and going into business for themselves.
Yeah.
Because for so long, someone who was working for themselves was seen as kind of like antisocial, right? So if there's this big social project that everyone's participating in, and it's about national sovereignty, and it's about freedom, and it's about being free from foreign domination, right?
Yeah.
Which are values that I think that probably most Cubans share and hold very deeply. So if the national project is about freedom and is about all of this, but you prefer to work for yourself to make money, it's
contrary to the sort of just to the project. It's not going with the system.
Right. It's almost even against the system.
And in that way, it's sort of like reverse, where in the U.S., if it's like, what's wrong with you? Why do you want to be a teacher? Don't you want to be a banker? Don't you want to go make a lot of money? Like, What's
Right.
Yeah.
So there was a moment in time in which the person in Cuba who wanted to go to business for themselves and to make money, that was their goal, to make money, was seen as like
so
contrary,
Yeah.
and that's changing, right? Because now the state can't support the payroll that it had before, and it needs people to go off on their own and to have their own business and to be part of the motor of the economy, right?
So, do you see necessity as fueling those sort of changes, or is this going to be something that is just a long process of learning?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? So, one of the things in the first wave of reforms in the 1990s, the political discourse was very clear that what was happening.
So is it going to be necessity that fuels this sort of change to this new economic system, this perspective, or are people going to have to unlearn this idea of working towards the nation, Cuba for Cubans? Are they going to have to somehow learn me?
I really hope not. I think one of the things that gets talked about a lot these days is there's a lot in the political discourse about a crisis of values. That these values that I was telling you about solidarity, about making your life a part of constructing a more equal society. There's concern that those values are being lost, right? And I think it's something that happens in all kinds of contexts, right? So there's always this concern that society is changing, and a fear that the change will mean that new values become more important than the values that were important to the generations before, right? And so there's a lot of concern among older generations where they see the kind of adjustments that people have had to make it through the special period are things that are more focused on thinking about me, right? How do I survive? How does my family, how do we get through this? But the we becomes we, my family, rather than the we, the national family, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that happened as a result of the economic crisis, that it becomes harder and harder when there's economic need for people to think of others, right? But I think that's one of the things that even in the special period that's inspiring, right? Because I feel like in other places, you share what you have left over. Like if you share what you have enough of, right? If you have enough of something, then you share.
Right.
Right. And in Cuba, I've found that it's you share what you have,
regardless,
right? So on all different levels, right? So if you have a pie, right, and you divide it up, and everybody gets a slice,
right,
and everybody slices the same size.
It sounds like communism.
That's what it is, right? Everyone slices the same size, right? But if your pie is really, really small, right? If you're a poor country, everyone gets a slice.
Right.
Which means everyone has a really small piece of pie. Right? Which might not be enough.
Right.
Right? But everyone gets a piece of pie. Right?
But not anymore.
But the things are changing.
Things are changing.
This
is why.
So now it's like you can bake your own pie too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, I totally understand.
Right? And I think one of the things about Cuba is that there still is, right? I think the older generations in any context, they always worry that things are changing too fast or that the values that are important to them are being lost, right?
Yes.
And I think even the fact that people, they're not being lost, right?
Interesting.
And even I've seen people who have small businesses but they grew up in the society, right?
Right.
They grew up in a society where you have whatever you have, you share it,
Yeah.
right? And I've seen friends, I've seen people that I've met through my research who have small businesses. They've left the state sector. They now have started their small businesses, working for themselves. They're successful.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they are,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And now they have more than they look around people around them and they see, I have enough, right? I have enough.
I've never heard an American say that.
No, I think it's one of the things, like in Cuba, for most people, there's a lot of things that are more important than money.
Right.
So if you're working hard and you now have made enough money, you take the day off. Let's say you're working as a taxi driver.
Yeah.
Right? When you make enough money, you go home.
Yeah.
Because your family's there.
Right. Right.
You have a life, right?
Right.
This is what you do to make money. But there's more to that.
Yeah.
There's more to life than that, right? So Cuba, I think, is a place where people share what they have. And now there's kind of a small group of people who have been able to have their own businesses, who are making money, and they're looking around and they're saying, how can I share this? Because they grew up in the socialist society, right? And I think those are the things that prove to me that the values aren't being lost, right? They just look different.
Interesting.
They're the same values, but they're just being lived on in different ways, right? And I think that these changes, you asked, are they here to stay?
Is this going to fade? Well, because the next generation is going to have more and more contact with the selfie generation of America and the rest of the world. I'm not singling out America, I mean, they see people taking selfies, the tourists and things like that. And do you think that, then what is it going to be with the next generation? I mean, predicting that we're not future predictors.
I mean, I think it goes back to this myth, and I think it's in the U.S., that Cuba is a really isolated society and that they're stuck in time, right? Cuba's not an isolated society. Especially since the 1990s, one of the strategies for getting out of the economic crisis was developing tourism. And the tourism didn't come from the U.S. It came from all over the world, Europe, Canada. And those people, they were here.
Years
and
for
Cubans
decades.
were having contact with them, and Cubans were falling in love with them, and they were going to study abroad. I mean, there's all of these connections between Cuba and the rest of the world that just because the U.S. kind of woke up today and realized, oh, Cuba, oh, what's that about? Let's go visit there. Cuba has had connections all over the world.
Do you think the world...
That didn't stop because the U.S. stopped paying attention to Cuba.
Do you think the world will start more so turning to Cuba? Like recently the United Kingdom, created like this Department of Loneliness where they're trying to help people who are just lonely. And you see a society, you walk around in Havana, everyone has their door open, like people are, I think the Cubans have mastered community. Do you think the world is going to start because it's getting very bad. I mean, people don't talk to each other anymore.
Yeah.
And it's weird. Everyone's always looking down at their cell phone.
Yeah.
Do you think the world might start reading your book and then take notes about what people talk like? I mean, this is a foreign thing. The earlier you mentioned about the grandparents, I'd like that because, in Cuba, if you say, how's your grandma doing? Well, I saw her this morning, In America, it's it's been a couple of weeks and
Yeah, no. I mean, I think one of the things that comes from having multi-generational families, some of that is cultural, that it's something that people actually want, right? Some of it is economic, that there's not other places that you can go, right? But, your family is not just mom and dad, my brothers and sisters, right? And grandparents have a super important role to play in Cuban families. They're the ones who wake up early in the morning and go get the bread because they're awake at 5 o'clock in the morning anyways, and they go buy the newspaper. They're the ones that, the parents are able to work because somebody goes and picks up the kids from school, right? And that's grandma. right? And takes them home and makes them a snack and helps them with their homework until the parents get home from work, right?
Yeah.
So, you know,
that's very cool.
That generation here is really important. And I think in a lot of places in the United States that they don't really have an active role, you know, in society.
Very interesting, yeah. Is there anything else that you want to say on your you know, this is such a unique experience to do an hour of history in Cuba. I mean, it's not every day that we can record here, so.
I don't know. Cuba's an amazing place. And, you know, if the rest of the world is having problems of loneliness, Cuba is the place to cure that problem. It's funny, in Cuba, someone who lives alone, people kind of like, it's like, oh, that poor guy, he lives alone, because it's assumed that you wouldn't want to be alone, right? Because there's such richness that comes out of relationships. There's like even a saying back when sugar was king here, that the person who has a friend has a sugar plantation, and because the sugar plantation owners were the richest people around, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a friend, like you have wealth, right?
Wow.
That you have the thing that's the most important.
Well, that's a wonderful positive message. And remind me of the title again. Everyday Life in Havana.
Everyday Adjustments in Havana. Everyday Adjustments in Havana.
By HoH Bastian.
That's right. Everyday Adjustments in Havana.
And go to your local academic library and request it, or buy it on any fine retailer online. Thank you for joining us. This recording was done after a full day of research and conversation and translation. So HoH has just run a marathon for us and is still standing and talking. That's when you know someone likes their work, when they're still willing to sit down and talk about it for an hour. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being on Hour of History, and I hope we can record again. I hope there's a follow-up episode later on.
Wonderful, yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, and Hour of History Studios signing off for the first time in Havana. Our world, anytime, any place.